Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for the 2023 Annapolis to Newport race webinar. I got a couple very special guests tonight. We thank you for taking time out of your night. I assume if you're here tonight, either your college team is out of March Madness or your bracket is busted beyond all repair, and you want to join us to talk a little bit about sailing. So without further ado, I want to introduce my co-presenters here. I'm joined tonight by Peter Eisler and Chris Bedford of Marine Weather. Peter, do you want to go ahead and come on and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi guys, I'm Peter Eisler. Go the Aztecs. We're still alive in the bracket of 16, so I'm here and there, but it's not, our game's not till tomorrow.
Thank you for joining us, Peter. And Chris, could you come on as well and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Here I am. I'm here. How you doing? I'm Chris Bedford. I am Sailing Weather Service is my company, and Peter and I have started Marine Weather University together, and our whole hope is to pass more weather information on to you all and make you better educated in how to use weather information and make you better sailors and better racers.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. And I know Peter is fresh off of, I'll give him a little shout out here, fresh off of an overall Caribbean 600 win. Is that right? On the Pyewacket?
Yeah, on the Pyewacket 70. I've done 3 offshore races this year, which might be a record. I just finished the Cabo race on the other Pyewacket, but the 600 on the 70, a turbocharged Volvo 70, was an incredible race and quite an achievement for a boat that rates as high as the Volvo 70 did. But thankfully we had Chris Bedford and Sailing Weather Services on board and helping us out pre-race, and that really made helped us a lot, as it does pretty much every race I do. I don't go anywhere without Chris helping me.
Yeah, Chris has helped out our crew in the last couple Bermuda races and Newport races, and he's done a great job with us. So his knowledge is invaluable. So today we're going to go over a big portion of tonight's evening is going to be Chris going over the historical weather and navigation for the Annapolis to Newport race. He's going to go back into kind of this time of the year, what you can expect for the upcoming race in terms of sails, wind angles, and weather. Peter's going to go over the offshore sailing game. And then after those guys finish their portion, I'm going to go through what it means for your sail inventory for your boat to complete the race. So that means what sail requirements you have to have, what different sails you can or cannot have, depending on what class you're in. We'll teach you guys a little bit about the different sail types, go over a couple of crossover charts, and then figure out what sails am I going to bring on my boat for the race. And then finally, we'll do a bit into the sail repair kit as well at the very end. So without further ado, Peter, do you want to take it away here?
Yeah, got it. I'll just reiterate how important the sail repair kit is. In the last offshore race I did, the A2 went up when finally the breeze came up, Newport Beach to Cabo, and it was all nicely furled up in its zipper. And the zipper failed to open. We have this fancy technique so the bowman doesn't need to go aloft to clear the halyards. Once you've done 2 spinnaker changes, you know how the spinnaker halyards get crossed, and you have to use some sort of technique to uncross the halyards, otherwise they get weaved into macrame. And at any rate, that system, as the sail started to open, it just opened to that point, and then the little lines that were clearing the halyards ripped the head of the spinnaker off on a 70-foot boat. Down came the sail that we're going to use for the next 24 hours. Gone was our chance of victory. But thankfully, we had a sail repair kit, and it's amazing what you can do with a little bit of 3DI cloth and some good glue and a little palm and needle, old school stuff as well. We put the A2 back together again, and I think it's ready to go do the Transpac race without anything further. But it's amazing what you can do with today's technology, and for any sort of offshore race, good valuable thing to have. Okay, I just wanted to make a quick presentation myself on the offshore game, just get us all kind of oriented a little bit as to the what we're coming up against soon in 71 days time. Annapolis to Newport race. So the offshore sailing game, it is still a game, but we're in it to win, or at least we have our goals. Hopefully you have your goals. Maybe it's not to win, maybe it's to do your first one, maybe it's to bring a certain group of people with you, but certainly you want to be safe, you want to be fast and do as well as we can. It is a race. So I just want to sort of paint a big picture, because as we go through the weather presentation and the sail presentation, and a little bit later about safety, you know, so you keep this in the back of your mind. Number one is preparation wins races. Preparation is key in life. And you guys are taking a step in preparation right now by coming to this class and learning a little bit, or refreshing your memories. For many of you experienced yachts, men and women, as to what it takes to win. And that means preparation is not just the boat, it's the sails and it's the crew. And you don't prepare by just sitting at your computer and doing things, but you prepare by getting out on the water, making lists, setting priorities, because we only have so much time. I have a good friend, Jonathan McKee, who won an Olympic gold medal with Carl Buchan, and they had a really cool philosophy. It was called perfect practice. They tried to keep regular jobs as during their Olympic campaign right up until the end. And so they tried to manage their time. So when they went out on the water, they were always full on. It didn't mean they didn't stop and have lunch. They were sailing a Flying Dutchman, which now isn't even in the Olympics. But they had a mentality that as soon as they left the dock, every tack, every jibe, every heading up, every bearing away was done with performance oriented, just trying to maximize the limited amount of time they had. And the same goes true for all of us, because we can't do full court presses and be as prepared as we know we could be if we didn't do anything else but sailboat race, but somebody's got to pay the bills. Another really challenging aspect, and one that I find very interesting in offshore sailing, is how to optimize human performance. This race is long enough where we will all probably, I'm going to do the race, we'll all probably go through that first 24 to 36 hours where it's hard to get on the watch system. Maybe it takes longer for some of you. And during that period, we're all a little sleep deprived. And if the race is hard, or if you need all crew hands on deck a lot, that time period gets extended. But the whole aspect of how do you make your crew, our crew, perform as well as they can in the situation is challenging. And it has to do with managing the sleep schedules, having a good watch system, the food situation, not making it so complicated that it takes extra time. I mean, performance of the boat is the number one issue here. Clothing, making sure you're warm and dry enough and everybody's got enough stuff. Yeah, you want to pack light, but in today's clothing, you can carry a lot of warm gear and still not break the bank in terms of weight. That said, when I go offshore, I bring one t-shirt, one pair of shorts, and all my warm clothes, and whether it's a 2-day race or a 7-day race, so it starts smelling. And then the decisions that are made during the race are all affected by these things. So it's something to think about, especially as for many of us, this will be the first offshore race, at least in the year. Another cool challenge of offshore sailing is you have to sail fast, like any race, but day and night while shorthanded. And this is not something we just think about and do. It's good to practice doing this. You know, if you're going to do an AB, some sort of AB watch system where half the people are on deck and half the people are below at any time, it's important to be able to figure out what conditions require more people and how to spend the people that are on deck for the various conditions. It really affects how you sail fast. How long do people stay on the helm? Who gets to drive? Who trims? So, and then of course, navigation and going the right way. And that is not just a single person's decision, but there should be an afterguard and a group of people engaged in this. And that's why you're all here today to hear the next presentation, which is going to be Chris talking about the weather, because the more all of us on the boat are involved with this, understand the strategy and the tactics involved, the better it works as a team. It's just like working in a business. If you're just told what to do and you don't have any input in it or understand what's behind it, you don't perform as well as if you're on board and in the loop. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn this part of the presentation to the best part of the presentation over to my partner in Marine Weather University, Chris Bedford. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Peter, thanks very much. Appreciate it. And let me share my screen now. And you will see here momentarily a presentation. There we are. Okay. So yeah, as Peter said, a big part of preparing is looking at the weather that you're all going to encounter. And that starts pretty early on, or should start pretty early on, when you start thinking about your sail wardrobe and what you're going to be needing during the race. And that is different for different races. Sail wardrobe you use on this race may be different from one you use on Annapolis to Bermuda, for example. And it's always good to understand where your weaknesses are in your sail inventory. If you have a particular sail that's been around for a long time and maybe starting to look a little old, and then you look at an analysis of the types of conditions you might be in, and it turns out you're going to have that, you could have that sail up 30% of the time, you might want to consider upgrading it or replacing it. So it's important to sort of do that preparation very early on, because it takes time on those long lead issues. The other advantage of doing a study like I'm going to present here today is that you can start to think about the navigational challenges that are in the race. And again, many of you have probably sailed this race before, so you certainly have some flavor for it. But oftentimes when you do an analysis like this, new things come to the surface, or it's just good to remind yourself what sort of the key points of the race are. So with that, we first thing we do is we have to kind of consider what are the sort of average conditions that we're going to encounter during the race. So what does it normally look like in the time period, sort of the latter half of May into the middle of June, that we're looking at? And what I've put up here is the average surface pressure chart. Now, the average surface pressure chart almost never occurs, but when I show you what happened in 2021, for example, you're going to go, I see some similarities between the average here and what happened in 2021. And so looking at these averages kind of tells you what sort of the typical weather patterns are in the area at that time of year. So here this year in this race, we're looking at the for anything along the East Coast, really, we're looking at the Bermuda High, and that's that white H I have over in the bottom right hand side of the image here. And the lines here are isobars. So these are lines of constant pressure. The colors are sort of representation of that. So the colors, the warmer colors are higher pressure. The darker colors are lower pressure. There's another feature besides that Bermuda High that is important. It's, believe it or not, it's this little trough line that kind of sits as semi-permanent feature. It comes and goes a little bit. As the summer progresses, it becomes a little bit more prominent, but there's oftentimes this zone of lower pressure just to the east of the Appalachians along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And it's that pressure gradient between the high pressure out here over the cooler waters of the North Atlantic and the lower pressure over the warming land mass as we head into summer of the eastern United States that drives most of the wind that occurs along the eastern coast. But at the same time, there's also local winds. So for example, because we're sailing through the Chesapeake, which is really sort of like thinking of it as a giant lake, maybe sailing through one of the Great Lakes. It's all very locally influenced, right? So we've got a bay breeze in the day, it's drainage winds through the river valleys at night. And then there's also sort of a north-south tendency for the breeze to blow sort of along the Chesapeake as well. So there's local winds that occur there. And then once you get offshore, you're off into sort of open ocean sailing, not completely divorced from the sort of sea breezes that will be occurring on the coast, but starting to get a little bit more separated from them and more dependent on the large scale weather patterns that occur. So you can almost think of this race in two parts. First is the sail down the bay, coming out Hampton Roads, and then turning and heading northeast toward Newport. There's sort of two separate parts to this race. Now that's the sort of standard pressure pattern, but you'll notice I've drawn an L up here, a low pressure up here in the upper left-hand corner. And for that, I'm just representing the sort of primary storm track that we have for this time of year. And what happens is as the seasons warm, the storm track, which is typically more through kind of the eastern United States in sort of the wintertime, moves up to the north, okay? And that high pressure, the Bermuda high pressure, you can see it extends a ridge axis down into the southeast coast, and that starts to work its way north as the season warms. And so the storm track typically moves up to the north. What this can do, though, is it can throw cold fronts down through the sort of the northeastern United States and off the coast. And as those pass through and they move off the coast, they're oftentimes replaced by a high pressure. And that gives us sort of our secondary weather pattern, and that is a northeast wind that can come into this race. So this isn't exclusively an upwind race from Hampton Roads up to Newport. This can, or a downwind race from Hampton Roads up to Newport. It can be an upwind race as well. And those of you that have sailed this many times know that all too well. And somehow Mother Nature always knows that the regatta is starting and tends to turn it into that worst possible weather pattern. But so there is some variability sort of around this average weather pattern that we have. Now, for those of you that did sail in 2021, these are the two surface weather charts. The one on the left for the 2 days of starts. One on the left is June 4th, the one on the right is June 5th. And I've drawn in a red line there, sort of the rum line between the exit from the Chesapeake and Newport. And you can see that sort of average weather pattern that I was talking about, right? You can see the high pressure, the Bermuda high out here, just to the east of Bermuda, the ridge coming into the southeastern United States. You see that trough line that's along the eastern seaboard there, and you see it on both charts. Here on the 5th, you see the high. It's moved a little bit further to the east and also to the south, basically because there's a frontal system now sort of aligning itself just offshore here in this area, and that's kind of pushing it a little bit further to the south. But more importantly is this low pressure that's up over the Canadian Maritimes. That's actually causing the pressure to lower and kind of pushing this high pressure to the south and turning the isobars more from a southwest to northeast orientation to a west to east orientation. So we do get this variability in that larger weather pattern that results from storm systems, low pressure areas moving across eastern Canada up in this storm track right up through this area here. So certainly we saw that last time. While the weather pattern was very similar to our average, it did have some variation to it, and that's called weather. So we look at the averages, that's sort of the climate look, but the day-to-day variation or the noise that is around that average pattern is what we refer to as the weather. Here's the routing that occurred on the 21st, and you can see most of it was sort of centered around the rum line. Once down the Chesapeake, we see that most of the routes are sailing downwind, not quite, but almost VMG toward Newport, not straying too far offshore. There are a few routes that go out there, but again, depending on the weather pattern, you can see a very interesting cluster, basically, when you look at these routings of, if you kind of look at the centroid of the routings, they're all sort of doing something generally very similar going up toward Newport. So, the weather that you actually start the race in sort of determines how the routing is going to play out. All right, so here's what the average wind field looks like, and I'm going to point something fairly interesting out in a second, but we see that the winds are generally from the south and southwest, and again, that's due to that flow around the Bermuda High. So let me go back. We see the winds coming up here from the south and then turning to the southwest, and again, our high pressure is sitting down here toward Bermuda with a ridge into the southeastern United States. Now we see generally lighter winds over the continental United States. This is largely because the winds are more, not only are they lighter, but they're also more variable in this area here. Now, one thing you'll notice by looking at this chart is you'll notice this sort of zone or area of stronger wind here. And that's sort of confined to this zone here. Closer to the Bermuda High down here, we have lighter winds, and then we have lighter winds on average up here to the north. And again, this is in part due to the variability of the wind here, more the southwest and sometimes northeast winds, but we do have this stronger wind. And this corresponds very closely, and in fact, almost exactly with the Gulf Stream. And so the Gulf Stream is bringing warmer water to the north. And when we have warm water with cooler air above it, it creates more mixing. And when we have more mixing, that means we're grabbing air from a higher level in the atmosphere that is moving at a higher speed and bringing it down closer to the surface. So near the Gulf Stream, on the warm water, we tend to have stronger winds. Alternatively, there is cold current running down from New England down toward the Delmarva, just inside of the Gulf Stream, and that's bringing cooler water down, and cool water limits mixing. And so the air tends to be lighter, wind speed tends to be less over the cooler water than it is over the warmer water. And you can see that even in the average wind field patterns here. You see it day to day, and you see it in the averages as well. Now, here is a chart showing sort of a general representation of the Gulf Stream. Now, normally the Gulf Stream is sort of out of the picture for this race. It's a little bit too far to the east to really consider and use. You have to have a really good reason or a very unusual weather pattern to go out there, but it is still worth taking a look at the position of the Gulf Stream and also, more importantly, the position of the eddies that ride off the northern or spin off the northern side wall of the Gulf Stream, because those sometimes can come into play. In this case, you can see there's some adverse current working in just to the north side of the Gulf Stream. So having a look at the current is important in this race. Now, each one of these stars that I put on here is a different location where we're going to look at the wind in a little bit more detail. First is that wind field through the on the leg that goes down the Chesapeake. So this star here, we put up this wind rose, and a wind rose is a frequency diagram of wind direction and wind speed. So for those of you that aren't familiar looking at these, it's the same as a bar chart, except that to represent the different wind angles, we use this circular graph, and the length of each one of these petals tells you how often the wind blows from that direction. And then within each one of those petals, you'll see the colors, and down to the bottom right here, you'll see the wind speed ranges. And so the sort of length of the color indicates the amount of time or the frequency that the wind blows at that wind speed. So for example, if we look at this south-southwest pedal, this one here, we see that lighter green color, which is 16 to 20 knots. We can see it's about 1 or 2% of the time, probably about 1% of the time. When it's from the south-southwest, it's in that 16 to 20 knot range. Now, this is the inside the Chesapeake. So typically that we see the winds are predominantly have a southerly component to them, but there's also variability around from the northwest and even from the east and northeast. So there's quite a bit of variability, and the winds, as I said, because you're surrounded by the land there, tend to be lighter. Now let's take a look a little bit further down and look at that windrows that's just off of Hampton Roads. And what we see is a very different picture. Now we see that the wind is very predominantly from the south and southwest. And that's because of the flow around the Bermuda high pressure, as I showed. And then we see a secondary maximum from the northeast. And that's those cases that I talked about when the wind post-frontal, when the high pressure builds into the north behind a cold front that moves off of New England and shifts the wind down from the northeast. And you'll notice that also corresponds with our strongest winds. So when it is windy off of Newport, Newport News, it is typically north from the northeast, unfortunately. So we hope that that's not the case for this race. Now let's go a little further offshore. I put a star out here, out over the Gulf Stream, just to show you the predominance of the southwest winds and also the importance of that mixing factor that I talked about when you're over the warmer water. So you can really see the predominance of the southwesterly winds. But when the wind is from the but there are cases where the wind is from the northeast. Again, that's when there's the odd low pressure area or frontal system that gets down into that area can cause the winds to come from the northeast. And for those of you that have sailed out in the Gulf Stream, remember that if the wind is from the southwest, the flow is with the current flow, it actually keeps the wave action down. But if you get a northeast wind over the Gulf Stream, those waves really stand up and that water becomes very rough in a hurry. So the Gulf Stream is a place to be avoided if the winds are from the any sort of north or northeast or east direction. Now let's look sort of at the middle of the track. And again, we see that southwesterly prevalence in the wind direction. Again, that's due to the flow or the gradient flow around the Bermuda High. And then we also do see this sort of secondary maximum coming out of the northeast and the east northeast. And again, some stronger winds associated with that. However, we see that stronger winds are showing up here, sort of the 24, 25 knot plus are showing up here along in the southwesterlies once you get further to the north. And that's oftentimes prefrontal. So if you have a cold front that is approaching from the west, those southwesterly winds can get quite strong along the Jersey coast. All right, and finally, as we get up toward Newport, we start to see a little bit more variability again. We still see the large frequency of southwest winds, which is common, again, thanks to the Bermuda High, but we also see more easterly winds and some northwesterly winds, just because we're in closer to that storm track, and we start to get some more variability as we get closer into the shore. We also see that the wind speed, the average wind speeds drop slightly as we get up closer to Newport as well. So those are the average conditions with some discussion around the frequency. And within these frequency diagrams, you can start to pull out some information about the different types of weather patterns that you may experience during this race. And that's where we want to go next. Because now what we're going to do is we're going to look and see what the frequency is of those upwind cases, what the frequency is of the downwind cases, what the frequency is of the different wind speeds. And that's what can feed into your sail chart and let you understand more about what sails you're going to be using most of the time during this race, or what sails are used more frequently. So I need to update this chart a little bit, but basically our goal here is to develop a true wind angle versus true wind speed probability table for this race. So how often are you going to be sailing at particular true wind angles and particular true wind speeds? And I simulated 4 different yachts actually, the Aerodyne 38, Cal 40, J120, and a J46. So the routing analysis uses historical data, actually historical grid data. And so this grid data, actually, I took it back for 7 years, and it is basically an hourly database of what the wind did at a 1/4 degree resolution along this race route. And what we can do is simulate running the race over those 7 years. And what we do is we don't focus on the actual race day. We focus on a range of days around the race day because we want to understand the possible weather variability that we could encounter and try to capture those statistics. And so we actually I do plus or minus sort of 15 days around the actual target race day. And that allows us that generates enough data for us to capture some good statistical representations. So basically, this is a small sample of what we're doing. We have the route in place. We define what the route is. You'll see that here, and then we run the weather, run each one of the polars through the weather for each one. Now, if you tried to match for a particular race this historical weather routing with what actually was sailed, you'll notice they never match. And that's okay because for a number of reasons, but probably the biggest reason is that the router in this case has what I call perfect weather knowledge. So in this case, it knows what the weather is going to be up the track. When you sail the boat in a race, you don't know what the weather is going to be. You have a forecast of what the weather is going to be, but you don't know for sure what it's going to be. And so your route will differ from this analysis, this sort of perfect analysis here. So it's important to understand that difference. So here I have 2 slides, each with 2 boats on it showing the route clouds from the analysis. So on the left here is the Aerodyne 38, on the right is the Cal 40. And so we ran it through that weather database, and these are all the routes that got pushed out for that race and for that particular simulation. So it gives you an idea sort of the range of possible routes that you might take. And it's interesting, there are some that go pretty far offshore sometimes. And like I said, there are cases where the weather is such that you want to go way out to come into Newport. And then other times is sort of like we saw in 2021, you stay relatively close to the rum line going up. On the upper left here is a table showing the simulated average fastest and slowest times on each one of these polars, for each one of these polars. And then here is the J120 on the left and the J46 on the right. And again, you can see that there's some outlier routes here, some that really go aggressively offshore. Now, would you ever do that in a race? Probably not, just simply because from a risk standpoint, it's pretty far to go offshore. And again, when you sail this race in reality, you do not have this so-called perfect weather knowledge that the router has. And so you're going to sail the race more conservatively. But most of these routes are sort of clustered around, reasonable reality given the weather pattern for each one of them. Then for each one of those routes, we have a route detail, a route detail table. So each one of those routes, we have a time, the direction of the wind and the wind speed, the true wind angle that it was sailing, and for the whole route all the way up. And in addition to that, we also entered the table with the sails in it. So what wind angle, wind speed each sail is used for. And so you can see here, it's listing which sail it would have up at the time on that particular segment, time segment of the route. So we're able to take all that information, particularly the true wind speed and true wind angle, and then the sail information, and develop some statistics. So first of all, here's the Aerodyne 38, and we start to see a few things that that jump out at us here. And first of all, we see this upwind section here, about 20%. And then we also see this sort of downwind section here, which is sort of about almost 40%. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between. But here, between this upwind and the downwind, sort of the upwind, direct upwind sailing, upwind VMG sailing, and the downwind VMG sailing, we're sort of in the 60% range. So 60% of the racing is there, and then off angle sailing is sort of the rest. And then the other thing that we can see is sort of the wind speed ranges that we're typically sailing in. And in this case here, sort of between 6 and we'll call it, say, 16 or 18 knots, sort of is sort of the core of this race. But there are, 12 plus almost 13% of the time when it's pretty light. And then another percent of the time, sort of a 10 to 12% of the time when it's pretty fresh. So this helps us sort of give a broad overview of sort of the wind ranges that we're going to be operating in. And so we have these tables for each one of the boats. That's the Aerodyne 38. And then this is the sail chart. So this is telling us on the average routing, what percentage of time each one of the sails will be up. All right. So in this case here, the A1 and A2 take up about 40% of the frequency table. And then we have the jibs, which are taking up another sort of 45% of the time. The light and medium jibs taking up another 45% of the time. So that's all the kind of information that you can draw out of this type of analysis, and it's really quite valuable. Here's the Cal 40, and you'll see that given its polar, that it can sail deeper angles at higher wind speeds, and so we start to see some of those show up on here. Again, this is all dependent upon the particular performance of this boat and the sails that it has up. This is the sail chart for the Cal 40 percent of time that each one of these sails is in use. So this is the J120. Kind of looks similar to the first one, still around 20% of these VMG upwind. And keep in mind that a lot of the upwind sailing is actually, given the frequency diagrams, is actually leaving the Chesapeake. A lot of it is in the lighter to light medium wind speeds coming out of the Chesapeake. And then you turn and you start to head northeast toward Newport, and you're back into that sort of higher frequency of southwesterly winds that take you up to Newport. And one other thing I should make sure to point out is these are based upon time. So it takes longer to sail upwind and than it does to sail downwind. And so therefore you'll see higher percentages at upwind time, but we're doing this to see how much, what percentage of time a sail will be up. So that's the point of this analysis. And this is the J120 wind table, a wider selection of sails in this case. So you can see there's really only 3 that are pretty high use, but there are some important ones that have lower frequency. And who's to say that on a particular weather forecast, the A3 isn't going to be the 30% sail? So it's not out of the realm of possibility, but on average, this is what we would get. And then here finally is the J46 analysis. And again, we see the upwind versus the VMG downwind, and some particular things about this particular polar. You'll see a little higher frequency in the 110 to 120 wind angle than we see in some of the other boats. And here's the breakdown of those sails for the J46. So you can see there's a lot of power in these analyses that and you can get a lot of information out of them. You can look back. One of the interesting things to do is, if you have the time, is to go back to those root clouds and actually look and see what weather was driving a particular route. So you can look at some of those far offshore routes and say, hey, what was the weather pattern that caused that boat to sail or that particular race to be so far offshore? And you can just step through the weather in time and watch the boat sail through it and understand what was causing that. And that's a very valuable exercise to go through, because it does help you from a navigation standpoint and understand how the weather impacts your routing. So with that, if you have any questions, I'll be monitoring the chat room, and I'll try and answer as many as I can. And I'll throw it back to you, Peter.
All right, thanks, Chris. Excellent. You had, before you quickly took off your share, a satellite image. How important is, do you think, this in this particular race, how important is satellite imagery and being up to speed with being able to read and get satellite information and read it?
I'm a huge advocate of satellite information. You know, weather models and looking at just one thing you need to do with weather models is verify them. So you need to make sure that they're handling a situation particularly correctly. If they're not, then you have to distrust, you know, the future forecast of the weather model. One way to sort of verify weather models, particularly over an area as we're sailing in, rather than looking at just point data, which may be way off of an area, it may not be available for where you're going, or maybe way off from where you're going to be, the satellite sort of fills in the gaps. And so I think being up to speed on satellite imagery is really valuable. And in particular, understanding how wind behaves around clouds you can sort of combine that knowledge with the satellite image so that you can add more value to just the general weather forecast as you're sailing along.
Excellent. Yeah, the in Marine Weather University, of course, Chris has a curriculum worth of education, and one of the funnest classes for me was taking the satellite and radar class, which really taught me a lot and refreshed my memories. Another thing that came to mind when I was looking at the route clouds for the different boats is it's interesting. They are, you know, some boats go further east than other boats, and you know, they're wider or narrower. But it totally makes sense, as you say, the historical routing, which is what you're doing, has perfect knowledge, because every time step the weather model has been updated with information, whereas when we're doing weather routing into the future, it's just a weather model using its best guess as to what the conditions will be. And on top of that, but every boat is a different speed on different and has different polars if it's VMG, and different angles when it's VMGing. So it'll be a different place in the ocean, and therefore you do get different conditions. Hence the phrase "horses for courses."
Yeah, it is a multi-dimensional problem for sure. There's a lot more going on than just understanding the weather. Understanding the performance of your boat and the sails that you have on your boat is key. Yeah,
and this sort of historical study ahead of time not only gets your head around the big picture, which, as Chris will teach you, is the first step in even your daily analysis of the weather, much less when you're preparing for a race, but also it's the historical analysis helps you also prepare potentially your equipment and your sail quiver, right, Austin?
Yeah, exactly. Which is kind of what segues us into the next part of this talk, which is preparing your sail inventory for the race. And for the race, you have both sales that you have to have as per the NOR and the rules of the race, and then sales that you are going to need to get to Newport, and then maybe 1 or 2 sales that you'd like to have to help get there a little bit faster. So let's get into the sales that you have to have first, which number 1 is going to be a boat shall carry a trysail. So that means you must carry a trysail. The formula here is 17.5% of P times E. It has to be orange if it's manufactured after 2014. And then there is one caveat to that, which a mainsail with a reef of at least 50% of the P, which for those who don't know is the distance from the top of the mast down to your gooseneck here at the boom. So if your reef can do 50% of that distance of that luff length, then you do not need to carry a storm trysail. So either if this is your first time doing the race and you're getting ready, you either need to have one of these nice orange sails and make sure you know how to use it, or you need to talk to your sailmaker about putting in that third reef so that you can be both race required ready and safe for ocean sailing. Number 2, a boat shall carry a heavy weather jib. So this is separate from a storm jib, which we'll see here in a second. This is somewhat of a confusing sail, at least with customers calling me in preparing for this race, trying to distinguish the difference between this and a storm jib. So a heavy weather jib has a different formula for it, where it must be 1 greater than 10% of the yacht's I dimension, which for those who don't know is the
Sorry to
height of-
interrupt, Austin. I think you need
Yep.
to share your screen.
Oh, is it? Sorry about that. Let me
No worries.
did not come through.
Yeah, all good.
So yeah, this is a picture of a trysail. Sorry, I did not realize I wasn't sharing there a second ago. But yeah, here is that trysail that we talked about, where it hoists typically next to the mast on a separate track, and has to be that 17.5% of P and E. Or you have to have that mainsail reef with at least 50% of the luff length, which is that distance. Now that you guys can see me, where my mouse is from up here to down here, it has to be 50% of that distance. The heavy weather jib is a sail that either sometimes sets inside of your headstay, sometimes it'll go up your headstay, depending on the type of boat that you have. But it has to be greater than 10% of the yacht's I dimension squared, but not greater than 13.5% of the height. And essentially what that means is it's going to be bigger than your storm jib, but it's still going to be significantly smaller than, say, like a blade jib that's 100% of your fore triangle. Some sails will have like a pennant on top and it'll be short hoisted. And then other people will just completely have a different shiv box on the mast that's lower down, kind of similar to what you see in this photo here, where it's set well inside. Finally, every boat has to carry a storm jib, not exceeding 5% of the yacht's I dimension squared. So this is a very teeny tiny sail. Some people use them as a dual purpose sail, where they're using it as a staysail inside of their outer sails, but everyone has to have this sail. Most people will set it on an inner forestay. There are some other products out there where people like zip them around your furled up Genoa. Though, that does meet the rule, but I do think if you are ever going to have to use this sail, having a jib that comes in on this inner forestay is, 1, going to be the safest, and 2, give you the best sailing performance out of the actual sail itself. Again, if it's manufactured after 2014, it has to be this orange color. So now getting into our class options. So depending on what class you're in for the race, it's going to drive what sails you can or can't have on your boat for the actual race itself. So our 4 kind of big options are ORC and ORC double-handed, where you're operating with a typical ORC certificate. Your sails are only restricted by the number of sails that are allowed on your actual ORC certificate. Number 2 and number 3, ORC Racer Cruiser and ORC Cruiser, are kind of new for this year, where both of these classes are geared down for maybe a little bit of they have different requirements in terms of what the boat can be, along with what sails you can actually carry for the race. And then PHRF is been around for a long time, and that is a performance handicap racing system where you're restricted only by the amount of sails that are on your actual perf certificate, along with what the NOR says as well. So for ORC and ORC double-handed, you have to have a current certificate with an APH rating of 600 or lower. Movable ballast is not allowed except for boats that are rated for it. And again, manual power except for boats that are rated for it. So I think looking at the scratch sheet when I checked it this morning, it's about 2/3 of the fleet is in this ORC/ORC double-handed kind of band. I'll get into that in a second. Once we go into ORC Cruiser Racer, this is one of the newer classes for this year. Again, you have to have an APH rating of 600 or lower. And just for reference, when ORC is talking about APH, the lower the number, the faster the boat. So all of these boats have to be faster than 600. But this class, along with ORC Cruiser, has some sail restrictions as well. So you're a maximum of 2 headsails, each with a greater area than 90%. So for example, on this J46 run that we did a 150% Genoa, and then a blade jib as our 2 headsails for that experiment. The full length of the luff of all headsails must be secured or fastened to the forestay. So that means they can't be like flying sails like you might see on a faster race boat. And then you're allowed 2 spinnakers on board. But the big caveat here is the mid-girth must be greater than 85% of the foot length of the sail. For those who don't know what that is, I'm going to have a picture here in a few slides and explain that a little bit more. But our J46, when we were kind of building this experiment out, we had this class in mind for that crossover chart where they had the Genoa, the blade jib, and then they had an A2 and an A3 as their other 2 spinnakers in this inventory. ORC Cruiser, again, has that same sail restriction, both in terms of the number of headsails and the number of spinnakers. But along with that, it has a dynamic allowance of 0.23 or greater. So to qualify for this class, your boat has to have a dynamic allowance of 0.23 or greater, which means typically it's going to be a little bit on the slower side. It's not going to accelerate as quickly. When you go into the definition of dynamic allowance on the ORC website, more or less, it's kind of accounting for the fact that every time you tack or you have to turn the boat, it's taking a little bit longer to get up to that hull speed that the polar table is showing you should be doing most of the time. And so it accounts for that. Essentially, we wanted to build a class for more like boats to sail together in, or maybe give someone an introduction into the offshore racing world and feel comfortable with the boat that they have. PHRF has been around for a very, very long time. If you need to get a PHRF certificate renewed for the race, you can go to this website here to get your PHRF certificate renewed. There are no sail restrictions other than what's in the NOR for this class. Before we get into the crossover chart examples, I'm going to just do a brief overview so you guys can speak the same language we speak as sailmakers in terms of classifying sails. So when we're talking about Genoas, which Genoa means an overlapping headsail, which goes past the mast, we usually talk about it in terms of percentages. So 155% is going to be mostly the biggest Genoa a boat with a Genoa will carry. And that just means that the luff perpendicular, or a line drawn from the clew to the luff here, is about 155% of the boat's J length. And the J length is the measurement from the bow to the mast. So we have 155%. Boats that carry a number 2 are typically like 140%. And all of these boats typically also have around a blade jib as well, so that when the wind really kicks up, they're not carrying a bunch of sail area around. Now, more modern boats typically have non-overlapping rigs, and we classify those jibs as J1, J2, J3, J4. Typically, these sails all have a similar area. They can get a little bit smaller as you go up through the range, but mainly the big change in the sails is both the shape of the sail and either the weight or the composition of the sail to handle the bigger wind ranges. So as the number goes up here, the intended wind range is also getting higher for the sail. Now, as we get into off-wind sails, we have a few different types of sails. We can have spinnakers, We can have some really specialty reaching sails. Staysails have become a big kind of the hot trend right now with double and triple headed rigs. And then outboard leads are just something that we're going to briefly touch over as well, that you're really going to want to have to handle any of the reaching side of the race that we could see either coming out of the bay or going to Newport. So there's two different types of spinnakers. There's symmetrical and asymmetrical. Symmetrical, a little bit of an older type of spinnaker, I guess, where you have a separate spinnaker pole. Both edges of the spinnaker are the same length, and then you have a foot length, and you jibe this pole side to side as you go downwind, and typically these boats sail deeper VMG angles. And then more modern boats more or less carry asymmetrical spinnakers, where the luff is longer than the leach of the sail, and you have one or two of these types of spinnakers to handle the different wind ranges and apparent wind angles that you would see on a typical race. When we're classifying these sails, both in the asym and symmetrical world, your even numbers are going to be your velocity made good kites, or your kites that you're typically sailing angles with and are deeper. Your odd numbered spinnakers are going to be more of your reaching flatter type sails. And so as the number gets higher, just like with the jibs that I spoke about earlier, it's intended for a higher wind range. So that is a symmetrical chart. You probably wouldn't carry all of these sails. You might carry 1, 2, or maybe 3 of these on a boat. And then on an asym, we have the same sort of example here, where the odd numbers are handling the reaching, and the even numbers are handling the VMG sailing. As the number gets higher, again, it's for the higher wind range as well. So reaching sails, this is where we're going to get a little more into the nitty gritty, both in terms of the types of reaching sails and then what classes you could use each reaching sail in. So we're going to get into kind of the code sail world, which is sort of combined with headsail set flying, or HSFs, jib tops, staysails, and outboard leads. So code sails. The original code 0, which was invented, I think was probably first used in a Volvo ocean race in the early 2000s. It was more or less a rule beating sail, where the mid girth, which is this measurement right across the middle of the sail, had to at least be 75% of this foot length number right here to qualify as a spinnaker. So these boats were kind of struggling in the lighter air when they were tight reaching with just these non-overlapping jibs. So they built these code sails, which actually measured like a spinnaker, to try and sail really, really tight to the wind. They weren't the best when they first came out. They were a little bit flappy and unstable, but after 20 years of design and refinement, they've become quite nice and useful sails. So if you're in perf, you could have one of these code sails, and it must have a mid girth of 75% or higher to fall under your asymmetrical spinnaker category. If you're in ORC, you can have one of these code sails, except for if the mid girth is between 51 and 74%, you have to declare it as a headsail set flying on your certificate. And then if it's over 75% and it up to 85% of that mid girth, you still have to measure it as a spinnaker on your certificate. In both instances, it will be assessed on your rating certificate in terms of your polar output and your performance on your rating. These sails have a really big advantage because they're easy to deploy. You can sail along, and if you're just cracked off reaching and you think, hey, the wind's gone aft on me a little bit, maybe I can put up a bigger sail. You can easily hoist and unfurl the sail and try and go faster. And then eventually, if the wind gets too far forward or it gets too light or too heavy again, you can furl these sails up easily and drop them to the deck. So again, this is just a little bit of a chart showing the intended wind ranges of these different types of code sails. We classify them here at North as a code 0 is typically going to be like a 75% mid-girth sail, like I spoke about earlier. A code 65 is just going to be a 65% mid-girth sail that you might use in ORC or IRC. And then a 55 is an even smaller mid-girth sail geared for even tighter wind sailing. And as you can kind of see from this chart over here on the left, the smaller the mid-girth, typically the tighter you can take it to the wind. The one thing to remember here is if you are thinking about doing that ORC Cruiser or ORC Cruiser Racer class, you cannot use those sails in that class because the mid-girths are under 85%, which is what's required to be higher than to compete in both of those classes. One thing we've done to try and make these sails better is we've started structuring these luffs so that the cables that are in these sails to help them furl don't have to be quite as big or heavy to make these sails furl correctly. So we've started adding more either fiber or heavier panels in a paneled code 0. So then the sail can actually kind of take over and fly a bit more like a tight-winded asymmetrical spinnaker and actually have the luff stand forward. This one allows for a better flying shape and a more stable flying shape, and 2, you can typically take it closer to the wind. One other advancement that's come from these types of sails is now we began structuring the luffs of upwind sails as well, with the idea of carrying less sails overall when you go offshore. So maybe instead of having a J1, a J2, a J3, and a J4, you might be able to have like a J1 that goes halfway up into your J2 range, and then like a J2 that can go all the way up to maybe your J4. And then you save 1 having to buy an extra sail, and 2 having to take that extra weight offshore. This is the other benefit of that helix luff that I talked about. On the left in both of these photos is a traditional code sail with that heavy cable, and you can see it's always really struggling to get tight so that you can take it close to the wind. You have a bit of luff sag off of center line both there, and then in this photo here you can see it's almost got this kind of inverse luff shape, which originally people were okay with putting up with, but as we've wanted to refine these sails, we're trying to make them more stable and fly better. We've changed the design shape and the design philosophy a little bit with the helix code sails, and you can see now it stands, almost to windward when tensioned properly, and you get that nice positive luff lens projection over here forward as well. Jib tops are another popular reaching sail option. More or less, a lot of the jib tops that we put on boats are actually old Genoas that we recut for clients and bring the clew up. And essentially all it is it's a Genoa with an LP or a luff perpendicular less than your biggest Genoa so that it doesn't hurt your rating, with a higher clew. Because as we all know, as we ease these sails out to go into a reach, we typically lose the top of the headsail and it twists open a fair bit. So when you raise the clew on these reaching sails, you're able to keep them eased off and actually keep the leech engaged as well while you're reaching. So this on say like a J46 or maybe a J120, any boat really with a Genoa that's rated up to 155 might find that a sail like this is very beneficial either when coming out of the bay or if you get kind of a weird weather pattern and you're tight reaching your way up to Newport after Block Island. Staysails, there's 2 different types of staysails. There's spinnaker staysails and Genoa staysails. Pretty self-explanatory here. A spinnaker staysail is going to be up when you have the spinnaker up, and it's a pretty tall, high aspect sail, usually a very lightweight material because the apparent wind speed on it is usually not as high because you're moving with the wind when you use this sail. And then a Genoa staysail is going to be a little bit smaller, and you're going to fly that either inside your Genoa or your jib when you're tight reaching. Both of these sails typically work better the more wind that you have. So if you're sailing around in under, say, 7 or 8 knots, it might not be the most useful sail, but as you get higher and higher through the wind range, the staysails work more and more for your boat. Here's a couple of just nice photos of it. Here's a symmetrical kite boat using a spinnaker staysail downwind, and you can see it's very tall, goes almost all the way up to where your jib halyard is, and it is a very lightweight and kind of twists and mirrors the image of a symmetrical kite or an asymmetrical kite. And then this inside of here is actually, I believe, this boat's heavy number 4 that they're using kind of as a staysail inside of a code 0 or a jib here as well. Dual purpose sails. So on a lot of the boats we sail on, if you don't have a Genoa staysail, we might throw the storm jib up if we're reaching along in say 15 to 20 knots and the jib is over the lifelines and we're too tight to put up either a code 0 or a spinnaker, but we just know we aren't going as fast as we could. You can actually bring a storm jib up onto deck and fly it inside of that jib. One, it helps reduce the rudder angle on the boat. So if your rudder angle is less, you have less drag on the boat, you go faster. And then two, it kind of helps just balance and steady out the entire sail plan as well. And you get that extra boost. The fastest time you ever go with a staysail is when you first unfurl it or raise it. And then the fastest time you also go is when you put it back away. That's just a rule of thumb, is you always feel better after you put it up or you take it down. For these crossover chart examples, like Chris talked about, we did the Aerodyne 38, which we wanted to use as a kind of a modern ASIM non-overlapping jib example. We have a J120, which we wanted to use as an overlapping Genoa example. And then this J46, where we kind of wanted to show what an ORC racer cruiser inventory would look like. So here is a crossover chart, which you can get typically from, if you ask your sailmaker when you're getting a sail built, where the intended wind range of that sail is going to be, and they can help you build out a crossover chart. So this actually will also plug directly into Expedition, which is what most boats use as navigational weather routing software. And so it uses both your true wind angles, your true wind speed, apparent wind angle to generate all of these different bubbles. Here on this boat, just for reference, when we have LM jib, MH jib, heavy jib, those would correspond for your J1, J2, J4. But here is a typical kind of modern inventory, what it would look like on your moderately fast non-overlapping rig boat. We have a J1, J2, we have our heavy air jib, we have a code sail, which is handling a lot of the reaching, and then an A1, A2, and A3 on this style of boat. And I think we know from what we've seen, these sails right here and these sails right here are going to be getting a pretty heavy workout. I did the last race on a boat with more or less a similar inventory to this, and we spent a lot of time on this light jib getting out of the bay, and then a lot of time, pretty much the entire rest of the race, on the A2 VMG running our way up to Newport. On this J120, the downwind sails more or less are the same in terms of both having the A2 code sail. This boat has an A4 instead of an A3, but this is all relatively similar. Their A3 comes in a little bit tighter winded on this boat, but the big difference here being they have a Genoa. This number 2 Genoa is probably that 140 example we talked about earlier, and then the number 3 is probably a non-overlapping jib on this boat. You can also see right in here that jib top that we spoke about earlier. It has somewhat of a narrow range. So maybe if I was going to go sailing on this boat about to do the race, I might look at the weather and say, okay, do I think I'm going to use this jib top or this A3 more, and maybe try and save some weight and leave one at the dock, just depending on what we think the weather is going to be and the chance and how much the A3 or the jib top actually weighs on the boat as well to affect the performance. Now for our ORC racer cruiser example, we have this 150 Genoa, which we saw pretty much handled the bulk of the work, both getting out of the bay and for any of the other upwind work that the boat saw. And then what I actually thought was surprising was there was a lot of A2 work, but then there was also a lot of A3 work. And so that means, one, if I'm going to do this race and I'm going to be an ORC racer cruiser, I'm definitely going to want to have like a nice proper running A2. But there's always that chance that you maybe get a rip in your spinnaker or a jibe doesn't go perfectly right and we actually damage that A2. And that's where it's really important to have either a good sail repair kit or a backup, like a flatter, smaller, heavier winded spinnaker as well that you could put up to get you the rest of the way to Newport. It would be a real shame to get out and get ready to do the Annapolis to Newport race and then rip a spinnaker and then have to go wing on wing the entire way from the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay to Newport. So I think if I were doing racer cruiser, I would have 1 and 8, like a big, nice A2 that I'm really comfortable VMG running with, and then maybe a slightly smaller, 1.5 ounce type A3 that if anything went wrong, 1, I could put it up VMG running with if it's really windy, 2, handle some reaching, and then 3, have just an overall backup spinnaker that's good for the boat. So decision time with sails. So based off of the historical data and the runs, typically you could see kind of a big upwind and then a really, really big downwind race to Newport. That's what it was more or less the last time I did it. But then the couple years I did it before that, it seemed like it was upwind the whole way. So prepare for everything, but this is at least telling you what you more than likely will see. Make sure you look at your rating certificate, whether you're in perf, ORC racer, cruiser, any of the classes, to know exactly what sails you're allowed to have and what sails you have to have. And then the big one is, if you're racing in any of the ORC classes, get your sails remeasured by a certified measurer, because sails do shrink over time and you can gain some rating back by remeasuring your sails to make sure your certificate shows exactly what sail area you're putting up at the dock or when you're out sailing. The other thing that really affects your ORC rating as well is your declared crew weight. So one, make sure you figure out how many people you're taking to Newport, and then two, ask the difficult question of how much they weigh or how much they think they might weigh by the time June rolls around, because you want to make sure that that's accurate so that you have the most accurate polars and rating certificate possible to do the race. Sail service, you always want to get your sails in over the winter to have everything looked at. It doesn't take long for a small rip to become a very big rip when you're offshore. So having it come in professionally looked over, finding little issues that can become big issues are very, very important. Checking your furlers, checking your snuffers, all of these things we want to look at before you try and do a big race like this when we are going out in the ocean. What to have in your sail repair kit. I would talk to your sailmaker for specific materials, like Peter's example. If he's got 3DI sails, he's going to want to have some additional 3DI material that he can then glue on over a rip or a tear that might happen in the sail. You want to have some spinnaker material that is going to match the type of spinnaker that you have. You want to have a really good pair of scissors, needles, and then you got to have someone who knows how to use it. So I don't know how you delegate that. It's good to have someone who has either worked in the industry or who has a little bit of sewing experience to practice on land before you go offshore to do these kinds of repairs as well. And questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Peter here for a little bit of a closeout.
Hey, nice job, Austin. And you can jump into the chat room, and there's been some questions about heavy air jibs and stuff. So folks, please use the chat room. Chris is still here as well. So any questions you have, it's double prizes. All right. So a few years ago, I had quite a life-changing experience on a sailboat. And I promised myself two things. One, that I would always smell a rose anytime I walk past a rose after that moment. And the second thing I promised is I would become an ambassador of safety. So any Peter Eisler presentation wouldn't be complete without this part of the show. Welcome aboard, staying safe offshore. There's the Rambler 100. In fact, I think the last time I did the Annapolis Newport race was possibly on the 100. At any rate, it was the first really of the new modern super maxis, which are mostly together down in Australia right now and do the Sydney Hobart race and some races down there. 100 feet long, basically a turbocharged Volvo 70, water ballast, canting keel, obviously all carbon. And the Rambler team with George David, the owner, of which I'd been sailing on for a number of years, chartered the Speedboat, which is a 1K design super maxi, and we started sailing it around the US and ultimately sailed over to across the ocean, breaking the transatlantic race record, which still stands today. And it was really an incredible boat, just so much fun to sail and so challenging to sail and learn how to do it well. But this was what the boat looked like about 6 months into our adventure. We started out in the Caribbean and the Caribbean 600, and that's a picture from the Fastnet race in the Irish Sea. The keel fin broke off because it wasn't strong enough, and the whole crew got thrown into the water, except the 4 crew members that did the high side laser roll and stayed dry. So I just wanted to take a minute to refresh your memories and to sort of hit some high points and takeaways from me. There's a shot of those of us, the 17 crew members that didn't get separated from the boat, 5 people did get separated and were in 58-degree water for 3 hours, but luckily were recovered and there was no loss of life. And there's a picture of the crew that were ultimately got on the boat. Come to one of my safety at sea courses, presentations at the courses if you want to hear the full story. But we got onto that life-saving boat by a Avon raft that we shuttled back and forth with a rope because we didn't want them to hurt the hull of our racing boat, even though it was upside down. And really, we should be worried about ourselves. One of the main takeaways that I had from this experience is there's no substitute for proper safety at sea training. I saw some mentions in the chat room of the safety at sea courses, but also just offshore experience. This Annapolis Newport race is an offshore race. I mean, yes, you go down, as Chris says, it's really 2 races in one, but that second part of it is offshore, and you're out quite a few miles out of sight of land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And although it's fun to sail with friends and introduce new people to the sport, staying safe means that you have also some experienced people on board. I would not be alive. Not all of us would have survived had it not been for not only the training, but the experience level of some of the people that were made. Because when we reviewed the incident after it happened, the keel breaks, the boat turns on its side. 2 minutes later, the weight of the water ballast turns a turtle. I swim out from down below. We all climb up on a slippery, wet sanded hull and wait until the pocket AIS finally brings a search and rescue team out to find us. But the decisions that were made during the first 2 minutes, from the moment the keel broke to when we were all up on the hull, really saved lives. And that sort of experience comes from years of messing about in boats. So I would recommend always going offshore with some good, competent hands, as well as the balance of new people that keeps the sport growing and keeps everybody happy. Safety equipment. Boat, the rules have quite a requirement. There's inspections and stuff, but until this happened, safety equipment for me was like, oh yeah, it's a checklist. Sort of like reading the sail requirements. Yeah, we got a heavy weather jib. Now I'm engaged with what is the safety equipment? Where is it stored? How do you activate it? How is it used? Important stuff. And I recommend that you and your entire crew do that. Make that safety briefing not 20 minutes long before the start of the race. Spend a day doing it. Life jacket and harnesses. The two main lessons that I learned from this, the 2 main takeaways from the experience are, one, the lesson that my parents taught me when I first started messing about in boat is, both of them were that. One is always wear your life jacket, and the other is always stay with your boat. The people that got separated through no fault of their own had a lot higher chance of being lost at sea than those of us that stayed with the boat. And the life jackets and the harnesses help you do both. I sleep with my life jacket. I don't wear it all the time, but I'm the first person with it on, and I always know where it is. And I've blown it up and made sure it doesn't leak the day before the race. Yep, I do that, and then I repack it. It's happened to me. I'm not going to let it happen a second time where I pull the ripcord and it doesn't inflate. And I'm never one to poo-poo any owner/skipper's request for everybody to put the life jackets on, which I believe are the rules, the default rules for this race. I also always have channel 16 ears on during the race. And I promise you that if I'm in a race with you guys, if you call for help on channel 16 and I'm on a boat within hearing range, I'm going to hear it and I'm going to come back and help you, or find somebody that's closer than me to come and help. And I would request that you do the same. And that doesn't mean having channel 16 on down below where everybody's trying to sleep. You may leave it on down below, but it may not be monitored there. We on the Pyewacket, we always have a charged VHF. We have 2 of them. We just cycle through them loud enough that the watch captain or the person in charge near the helm can hear it. because a cry for help, we're all brothers and sisters out here. And I realize I've added to the slide that the AIS is also very important. Not only do a lot of people carry those PLBs now that trigger an AIS signal that you can see, but it's also important for being able to contact boats on collision courses, et cetera. So being able to monitor AIS, I do mine on Expedition, the software. You may have a chart plotter or something to use it, but another good thing, stay in the loop. You're not just racing, but you're also responsible for everybody, looking out for everybody else out there. And then finally, set the example. The more experienced people on the boat, if they are not putting on their life jackets when the owner or skipper requires it, or if they're not listening at the safety briefing, it goes a long way. No, then other people won't. So for those of you that are the more experienced people on board the boat, please set a good example with respect to safety. It could save somebody's life, if not in this race, down the road. All right, navigation. As Chris said, this is both a coastal race and an offshore race in one. There's the Gulf Stream, a little image from the Expedition software, and a couple of optimal routes. This is what I do for a living. Here's a few tips about the role being the navigator. One is, it's important when you are talking about strategy or tactics / navigation, that the message, the communication is clear. And we don't, most of the time, we don't practice this too much, but practicing and developing a system so that your team in the Annapolis Newport race can get the best out of the navigator, but have good interaction and understand. And it's not like a game of telephone. How many times have you come on deck and go like, well, what course are you steering? We're steering 030. But the optimum VMC course was 015. Like, oh, it wasn't passed on. So it's everybody's responsibility to help the navigator, strategist, tactician keep the boat and the mindset of the boat focused on what the short-term and medium-term strategy is. And that requires good communication, and good communication means not just doing it once a year, but practicing it. I've already talked about being inclusive and getting buy-in. I'm a big fan of having anybody and everybody on the boat that's interested in knowing what's going on to come on down to the nav station, have a look, to be involved with the pre-race weather briefings that we do with Chris Bedford, et cetera. I think it just helps everybody. And then finally, the final tip I have, that's me and Olympic medalist Charlie Ogletree on a Mod 70. And there's the navigator. Where am I? I'm not down below at the computer. I'm on deck looking at the clouds. In this case, there are no clouds. I've got my deck screen. I've got my helmet because it's a 70-foot trimaran capable of doing 35 knots. But the navigator should spend a lot of time on deck, because that's when you can communicate best with the team, make sure that the message is clear and the strategy, short-term strategy, is clear, and you can get your head around what's going on with the wind and the weather. Weather routing, a big part of the race, something that you will be definitely doing, probably not as much going down the bay, but from the bay up to Newport. And here's some key elements that go into weather routing that make it more accurate. Number one, instrument tuning. If your instruments are not well calibrated, and it takes a long time, it's a never-ending process. Most of the best calibration is done on short course windward leeward racing, because you do lots of tacks and jibes and leeward mark roundings. But if your wind angle is wrong and your wind speed is wrong because your calibration of your boat speed or your compass or whatever it is off, then you are going to assess your instrument's going to say you have a 320 wind at 15 knots, where really that's wrong. And when you're trying to assess which model is most accurate on the day, when you're trying to figure out which model to look at in the short term to bank on, to maybe weigh more heavily in your strategy, you might choose the wrong model because your instruments aren't calibrated. On top of that, if you're going to refine your polars, which are part 2 of this, you need to have calibrated instruments first before you can even take step 1 to try to do a better job at your polars than a VPP produced polar, which your designer or the rating rule provides. There's an example of the polar there, but I spend a lot of time on boats where I'm going to be doing weather routing, trying to optimize my polars, but it doesn't happen overnight. You got to go sailing, collect data. I teach a lot of this in my expedition courses at Northview and at the Marine Weather University Isler Academy. Information, it wins races. So let's talk just briefly about the information that's available. Cell data, have really good cell data. Don't tether off your phone that's sitting on deck so when it rains, somebody puts it below and you can't get connection. Have a get already means or a good marine electronics person to put in a proper cell data system. And because you're going to own it all the way down the bay, and you're going to want to be able to get some high resolution models in your last sort of big grab at some data before you go on to satellite connection, where you have to skimp a bit because you don't have as much bandwidth. And so at the southern part of the bay, you're going to be very interested in getting some freshies in terms of grid files. And you can't do that unless you have a really good cell signal and cell data and a system to get it. That's what I would recommend. How much satellite airtime do you need? Well, let's talk about satellites for a second. My general frame of rule is for an offshore race somewhere between 15 and 50 megabytes per day, because it's expensive. Now, there in the Cabo race, some boats were wire tying and hose clamping Starlink receivers on the pulpit, and it was working. But they stayed close to shore the whole way, and who knows what happens when you get offshore. So I've not done that at first. Figuring out how to operate in a low bandwidth environment, navigators, requires practicing at home and getting used to it. Because at home, we have a fast connection. We download all the grid files and rain and mean sea level pressure and high resolution stuff. And all of a sudden you can't do it. How are you going to operate? Well, there's some tricks you can use, but it takes practice to refine those tricks and be able to use them without staying awake all night long, burning satellite time. For when you do set up the plan, understand the pricing plans, the coastal versus global plans. And then the final tip, which surprisingly, like there was a couple boats in this most recent race I did, like, hey, I got offshore and the satellite wasn't working. Like, what do you mean the satellite wasn't working? Did you check it before you left the dock? No, the IT guy in my owner's company checked it. Check. Make sure your satellite works before you leave the dock. Don't be wasteful of airtime and data because it's money. So general rules have always been to turn off all the updates, like Windows updates and stuff, which takes a bit of geekiness to be able to do. Another really cool trick is to set up a whitelist. I thought I wrote it down there, but a lot of modems will allow you to set up a whitelist so you can just turn it on and only the websites or data streams coming in from Expedition that you want will be allowed. Because inadvertently, Windows computers these days, if you're using Expedition, you have to have a Windows computer. They can be sneaky about sucking data. So another thing is avoid browsing. Prepare your hyperlinks ahead of time. Prepare your where you're going to get your satellite data, where you're going to get your weather data, where you're going to get your ocean, the information, your weather charts from. How are you going to get your grid files? Practice all that ahead of time so you're not wasting data doing it. Kick off the cell phone. As soon as I go offshore, I change the password to the boat's Wi-Fi. Sorry about that, Jan. And so that I was doing the Cabo race and my phone beeps. I've been taking some pictures halfway through the race, like, oh my God, I'm on the boat's Wi-Fi. I broke the rule. But that's all tricks on how to avoid wasting data. And then don't use Gmail or your standard email. Have a low bandwidth specific email. I like SailMail. Xgate has one. And then what are you going to have? The Iridium, to me, I use both an Iridium Go and a faster system, whether it's the Fleet, the Certus, Iridium Go exec is really a Certus, and you know, the Starlink, maybe it'll be the home run for us sailors, but I fear I wouldn't want to go offshore in the Annapolis Newport race banking on the Starlink. But I always have a backup, and the Iridium Go is a great one. However, you can't throw an Iridium Go into the ditch bag and the life raft. So I bring an Iridium phone as well, not for data, but that's for safety. Navigating, a couple other tips for navigators: don't be a hero, get some rest, you know, that be efficient and practice so that you have more free time to go on deck and also to rest. I mean, you can make this job really hard if you don't practice doing your weather routing and getting your expedition chops up and running beforehand. Weather study and prep, you know, I've just highlighted a couple of the key places: oceanweather.gov, and then create a cheat sheet. So to avoid browsing, you create a set of links that enables you, if you so choose, to go look at an observation somewhere. It's really easy to do so without getting on and browsing and burning a bunch of megabytes. This is an example of the Transpac links from my Transpac course at the Academy. And then finally, before the race, about 5-6 days before, I'm really heavy into ensemble routing, which is very, very similar to what Chris did with the historical routing. It uses the same expedition routing tools, but instead of looking at past data, it's using ensemble global models to get a feel for the race. And that'll help the crew get an idea of what to bring on the race, what sail package we finally decide on, and it'll help you as the navigator and the strategical team get their head around what are going to be the big questions and the big challenges in the race. So in the Eisler Academy, I just reactivated it. There's a course that we did 2 years ago for the Annapolis Newport race, which is similar to this with this course, but there is a section on where I teach ensemble routing with expedition and some other great stuff. So if you're interested, go to marineweatheru.com and check out the Preparing for Annapolis Newport course. I just lowered the cost really low so that it's easy to go to. Navigators that don't know how to do ensemble routing, there's a full-on explanation of how to do it there. I would recommend learning it, because you don't do ensemble routing as such with all the global models once the race takes place, but I totally live with it getting before the race. So here we are, 71 days before the start. I'll look forward to seeing you guys all in Annapolis. It's been a while since I've been there. It's time to go back to school. And we got the Eisler Academy and Marine Weather University online in the cloud. Chris's classes are great. North U has a number of my expedition classes. They're a little long in the tooth, but they're really good for refreshers. So at Marine Weather U, we've got a special coupon code for you guys who are here on the live webinar, good until April Fool's Day. And that coupon code is faster. But the key thing is in sailing, never stop learning. Never, ever stop learning. It's like instrument calibration. There's always more to do.